they were dead because they were seriously hurt or whatever. And as you know, and I hope I made it clear, I believe that is not a case to end a life, because you don't know what the brain can do after a horrific injury, for instance. And you don't know what the brain is doing in somebody who still has brain activity. They may not be talking, they may not be very able to be vocal, but they may have incredible prayer for others, or other. I don't discount that God has a realm for them. Let's put it that way. Now, if somebody is brain dead and they meet the legal definition, I think that is brain dead. The brain doesn't relive after the brain's dead, much like you wouldn't expect, other than, a few examples like Lazarus and Jesus and a few others that, that were raised from the dead in the Bible by Jesus or by miraculous effort of a prophet. Other than that, I don't see people being raised from dead, other than also like things like at the crucifixion, when dead bodies came to walk around town for a while and be witnesses of the greatness of that miracle. So if you're brain dead, I think you're dead. If you're not, I think you're alive. And I just want to point that out. Now, this week, we'll carry on with a little more discussion about what to do, for instance, about cancer treatment choice. We talked very briefly about that, about long-term like Alzheimer's. And I'll re-mention that I made the statement that I think sometimes the body outlives the brain and that someone is not culpable. And I want to explain that a little further. But first, we'll do the trivia question. Let's go to, let me find it, make sure I ask it right. I misasked last week, so I haven't slept all week worrying about that. So let's see, we'll go to, this is probably the best way to ask, I guess, would be when Pilate had finished seeing Jesus in his last hours, he had him placed at a site of a judge's seat that was named what? That's probably the most fair way. The judge's seat where Pilate took Jesus, what was the name? And remember, for those of you visiting or new to class, whatever, the Bible trivia means that you can still go to heaven if you don't know it. But it is in the Bible. So that's what makes it a trivial deal. So what was the name of the judgment seat, the judge's seat, that Pilate had Jesus taken to when he had finished talking to him? So then we'll talk a little bit about the ethical side of things, as we had promised. So I was picturing wrapping up the Christian ethics discussion next week. And I think we should talk about just being a responsible member of our society in general. I'll put it that way. Things like, what do we do about taxes, laws, various ethical issues like that. So anybody happen to have that question where Pilate placed Jesus in the judge's seat? It had a specific name. And what? Yes, that's it. We'll go, and I'm going to go with the more modern English, which is stone pavement. Yeah, so this is John 19:13. When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat him down in the judge's seat at a place known as the stone pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. So that was John 19:13. John 19 is the chapter after 18. 18 is a great chapter. I just want to point that out. John 19:13, yes. So that was stone pavement, or in Aramaic, Gabbatha. Now, I just want to point out, and this is kind of one of those sort of just side thoughts that I happen to have at the moment, but when Jesus was placed on the cross, and Pilate had a sign put on there, this is the King of the Jews, what language was it written in? Three languages. What three languages was? Yes, Latin, Aramaic, and Greek. So why? Yeah, absolutely. So remember that this is a relatively non-Jewish Jerusalem in a sense, in that they had been under Roman control for quite a while. So there are a lot of Roman soldiers. So the official language of the Roman soldiers in written form was Latin, and spoken form was Greek, and the local colloquial discussion language was Aramaic. And so I think that Pilate put that up in all three languages because he could say that, well, I made it clear to the Jews that Jesus had declared he was king of the Jews, and that's why you wanted him crucified. He put it in Greek because the Greek soldiers who were there would read that and understand, oh, there's a reason we're doing a military protection of a Jewish crucifixion, because it actually was technically illegal for the Jews to put people to death in that during the Roman rule. They looked the other way often, like, for instance, the Sonia Stephen that Saul attended, because they didn't want to interrupt too much the religious nature of killing people for something. But they, I think, put it there so that the Roman soldiers understood why. And then I believe he put it in Latin so that if the Romans ever came and said, why did you bow to the demands of the Jews under your supposed control and have him crucified, he could say, well, I put there in your official written language that he declared himself to be a king of the Jews who was trying to overthrow the Roman government. So even though he wasn't trying to, I think that's why Pilate put it there. So anyway, just a side note. So this week we're going to talk about the issues involved in decisions of care from a biomedical ethical standpoint. So let's look back to Psalm 139 that we read last week. I just want to read a couple of verses real quick for the context. And as I was reminding people a moment ago, we talked last week about that if you're brain dead, you're just dead. If you're not brain dead, you are just alive. And so I think it's important to honor life in all aspects that we can. But the question came up last week, what do we do about somebody who has a bad cancer or a bad disease of some sort? It could be, ALS, the neuromuscular disorder that inevitably leads to death, or it could be, a terrible raging infection that's going to take maybe months to clear, for instance, and maybe then it wouldn't. And what did we do about the decision process there from an ethical Christian standpoint? So Psalm 139, real quickly here. Lord, you have searched me and you know me, and you know when I sit, when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You're familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you know it completely, O Lord. You hem me in behind and before. You've laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go to the heavens, you're there. If I make my bed in the depths, you're there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there, your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me and the light become night around me, even the darkness will not be dark to you, and the night will shine like the day. For darkness is as light to you. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place. When I was woven together in the depths of the earth, your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. How precious to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast is the sum of them. Were I to count them, they would outnumber the grains of the sand. When I awake, I am still with you. If only you would slay the wicked, O God, away from me, you bloodthirsty men. They speak of you with evil intent. Your adversaries misuse your name. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord, and abhor those who rise up against you? I have nothing but hatred for them. I count them my enemies. Search me, O God, know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. So all of that, and you can reread it later if you wish, went through it fairly fast. But all that is to basically say God's in charge no matter where you are. Enemies can come, and even then God's in charge. And that, I want you, just as a supposition for the moment, to think of this enemy here when he says, in verse 19, if only you would slay the wicked away from me, you bloodthirsty men. They speak of you with evil intent. Your adversaries misuse your name. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? Think of that as the syndrome that is coming upon you. We rarely, I would say, in current times have enemies at our gates. I have yet to leave the church building and be confronted by an army wanting to kill me for being here as a Christian. And I'm thankful for that, by the way. I think that's made my life much more simple. But when faced with a foe that is a potential damage to us, that makes us think the way this says, like, um, do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? I hear a lot when people have a dreaded disease that they wonder why God allowed them to get that. And I think that what really is true in scripture is it's not that God made them get it, it's that we have no physical protection on earth, but we do have spiritual protection. And sometimes the approach to Satan is to try to derail us as a Christian by presenting us with a very difficult physical task to face. That may be a stage 4 cancer, it may be mental illness, it may be a terrible wreck, it may be a brain injury, it may be ALS or other, syndrome that leads to death. It may be end-stage renal disease, needing a transplant. We talked about that a lot recently with our 3 individuals that were in need of kidney and 2 still are. And all those things, I think, can play a role in trying to derail us from God's will. And so when we start talking about those and how to handle those ethically, I think that's where the question was last week about, but what if somebody has, or I know somebody who has a terrible cancer and they've opted not to have a chemotherapy, radiation, surgical, palliation, whatever the options are for them to help heal that. And what is the Christian ethical viewpoint on that? So my answer, because I think it's fair to present that before we start throwing answers around here and there, is that I would say there's a big difference between informed consent of knowing what options are on something that may or may not actually even do anything. And that's just the reality of medicine. And I can tell you, for every person that's healed with treatment A, somebody is not healed with treatment A because somebody's body is not the same person's body as that was healed. And there is no 100% medicine. That's been possibly more talked about recently with COVID because, you hear people kind of almost even snarkily say, oh, I heard somebody had the shot and they still got COVID. So why get the shot? Well, when you look at the numbers, there's about 95% protection. That's kind of, to me, like driving a car. There are 120 deaths in cars every day in America. We discussed this at length last week about the numbers. There are innumerable injuries in car wrecks every day, and yet we still go drive. And I think, most of the time you get in your lane, you say, you watch the traffic, you wear your seatbelt, you love the protection of your vehicle, and most of the time you get there fine. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you're just devastated in a wreck. And that may be dead, it may be disabled, it may be permanent injury, and those things happen. So if we were to view then some degree of improvement versus no chance, like for instance with a stage 4 cancer, I think that has to be considered from the standpoint of a bioethical viewpoint. So the difficulty then, and I hope that's making sense, I'll re-explain if I need to, but the difficulty in my mind then is that we all have a terminal disease. Every person is going to die. And I hate to bring that up with you if you hadn't thought about it, but every person is going to die. I don't think we have Enochs around now. I don't think that, we have Elijahs to be taken up in the chariot of fire. I think it's a different era. And I believe every person's body is going to die and their soul is going to live on. And so if you start thinking about, let's say somebody like her niece was just diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, unfortunately. And I can tell you, about 3 years' time, that's about 96% death rate. And it's about 80% in the first few months. And that's horrible numbers. Those are horrible numbers. But so in theory, if you start talking about a debulking surgery or a chemotherapy or radiation, do you know that that's going to place that person in the better healing group? No, and I'll answer that because the answer is the death rate's the same. It may be postponed by a week or two, And maybe that's an important time phase in that person's life. But I do think that if you have informed consent from a Christian ethical standpoint, you have people praying for you to provide you clarity. You have, asking for wisdom and for God's will in that. If you know that you have a terminal disease, I personally feel like it is your right to say, I don't know if I'm going to be in the group that lives a week or two longer, or maybe a year longer, or 5 years longer. And I don't know that I personally can face that kind of treatment and challenge not knowing the sure outcome. The difference for me is that I think, from talking about brain death, I think that if you have dead brain, no brain waves, you don't recover from that. If you have brain waves, you may recover from that. And again, there may be a realm for the brain there that we don't fully understand, because I think God's amazing in his creation. So to me, that then brings up the next issue is, what about hospice? Everybody familiar with the term hospice, I assume? The definition of hospice is that you have been clinically judged to be likely to not survive 6 more months from whatever syndrome it is. That can be cancer, that can be Alzheimer's or dementia, could be Parkinson's, could be ALS, could be profound immunodeficiency from other syndromes. It could be a virus, could be a bacteria, could be a brain infection, on and on. There can be a lot of things that can cause a pretty likely and sure death within 6 months. Having said that, I know a lady who's been in hospice for 6 years, and she just keeps going. And it's interesting because I think back when she was put on hospice, everybody thought that was it. And so, even then, it's not a sure thing. But the idea on hospice is to allow a relatively controlled, painless, well, that's a matter of discussion too, a pain-controlled, relatively peaceful opportunity to basically say goodbye to your loved ones and realize that your time on earth is nearly over. And the idea on that is that most people who die, when they die, want to die in some sort of peaceful, controlled circumstance rather than in ICU with another surgery or another tube or another attempt at some sort of far-fetched idea by then to try to save them. And so that also, I feel like, personally, I think that with the informed consent of, you're going to not outlive everyone else on this earth because everyone dies, and you have a severely terminable condition, that I think it's your right to choose to have a peaceful ending to this life rather than a dramatic and difficult ending that probably will not be any different in terms of the time frame. So that's my ethical viewpoint on that. I'll mention one more and then open it up for discussion. The other is, what if you are a prisoner? Let's say you're a prisoner of, let's just make it as dramatic as we can. Let's say you accidentally somehow landed in North Korea. Maybe somebody grabbed you and shipped you there, postage paid, you land in North Korea, and you're identified as an American, and you're imprisoned, and they say, we are going to torture you until you are dead. We'll try to make this last 12, 15 years. We'll send pictures of your family so they can see how much you suffer. I'm trying to get as over the top on the idea here as I can, obviously. Would it be a fair Christian ethical viewpoint to say, well, I'm just simply going to refuse the piece of moldy bread I get each day and starve to death rather than continue this torture for as many years as they can do it? Would that be something where you have the right to control that life or death issue? I personally, again, this is my personal viewpoint, I feel that's very much like having a terminal disease. I think that if it is stated to you, much like, remember we read about the Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego story in the furnace, and we read about Daniel in the lion's den, and we read that they were clearly stated that if they worshiped the false god, they would not be thrown in furnace or lion's den, respectively. And if they did, they would be thrown in and killed for their actions. And that's a clear one to me because it's about worship of God and being disallowed, somebody saying, you may not worship Jehovah God. To me, that's a very clear cut one. If it is, we're going to torture you until you're dead because you were born in America, and we, maybe they haven't even asked you if you're, Christian, Democrat, Republican, Independent, Libertarian, who knows what. But because you're American, they're going to torture you to death. That's a little bit different to me. But I also think that if the option is, death is at the end regardless, I think that that's one of those extreme examples where it's probably an allowable Christian ethical issue. And again, I would hope that you have enough opportunity to pray about it and present that case before God. And I would wonder, are you there? Because some of those people will never hear the word of God if you weren't there. So I think you could make the argument that you shouldn't try to end that, because perhaps at some point somebody will become a Christian because of you. But I think that's highly individualized and extremely rare. So what thoughts do you have on any of those ethical issues? Is that a hand going up? I saw your hand twitch. Okay. I'd watch those hand twitches if I were you. Yeah. Yeah. Somewhere around that. Yeah. So a long-term martyred individual in prison for Christ, tortured for Christ. Yeah. Well, and I would make, we mentioned a couple of weeks ago the example of Sam Johnson, our long-term congressional representative, who's a prisoner of war in Vietnam for 7 years in a little box, and he outlived all his fellow prisoners because he was just resilient. He fought through that, being tortured, starved, whatever, and he, came back to live a very productive life of service for 40 years before he died a couple of years ago, age, I believe he was 90 or 91. And, I think his will to live clearly was a good example to people. Even I would think his own guards and whatever. So, that's a tougher one because it's not like there's nothing you could do to live through that. And you can be a Christian witness. But on the other hand, you can do that during treatments for a cancer. I mean, these are tough issues. And yes, I knew I saw a hand. Yes.
I was just going to say, in reference to having cancer and it being terminal, that I feel it's the decision of the individual.
Yeah, an informed decision is yeah.
Person after person after person go through those treatments, it's torment for the family to carry that burden. I once had a friend whose mom had cancer, and didn't take the treatments. And when she died, nobody knew she had it. She didn't tell her family she had cancer. So nobody suffered it.
That's a pretty unusual one. Yeah. And I think that informed consent is a very important part of Christian bioethics, medical bioethics, either way, Christian or just medical, either way, you should be allowed to know your options and allowed, as long as it is your decision or your appointed individual, to make that decision. The problem I run into at times is that everyone has a nephew or something that lives far away and hasn't seen you in 20 years and thinks you're the picture of health, and will sweep into town and realize, and when they hear his aunt is on hospice, for instance, he panics, says, oh, nobody will do anything. That's wrong. I'll take you to court. I'm going to, sue to have treatment done because my aunt is a stronger person than this. And I'm sure first of all, you probably misdiagnosed her. And second, she's not going to die. And that is a real world issue that happens. People have, wishes and desires, and they've made their peace. And they then often, and it almost always seems to be a relative from out of town who has not been in touch and doesn't know what all has been done, and suddenly panics. And so that's why I would just encourage everybody should have a living will and a advanced directive that makes things clear as to what you want to do. But as long as you are the decision maker, I'm okay with that. If you say, oh, I think my kids should decide, and just tell me their decision. You can't do that. No, well, and you can't do that, thankfully, legally, but you shouldn't do that. And you, frankly, you shouldn't, I think, try to persuade your loved one. I don't think you should try to dig up every horrific story about chemotherapy that you can find, because some people actually fly through it. And it's amazing that they don't even feel like they're on treatment and they are cured. Did you have your hand up? No. Okay. Sorry. I thought I saw another hand over there. It's probably Steve nodding off. Oh, sorry. I don't know who he is. Yeah.
That we're all going to heaven, and it's a paradise up there. And
Yeah.
some people's will to live is stronger than others. Their body is not, or not horny like some, but I mean, we forget that heaven, you know.
Yeah. Well, I think that's true. You know, it's interesting to me that whenever somebody dies, everybody says, oh, they're better off, they're in heaven. But boy, we wish they hadn't died. Of course we do. You know, it's hard to face grieving, but I do think it's fair to realize that maybe the person wants the reward. I just cannot, and I do want to emphasize, I cannot justify in any way a euthanasia process. That, you know, Dr. Jack Kevorkian made it kind of famous to promote suicide. And, you know, it's interesting. I believe the last number I saw on him would say he assisted 27 individuals. There are, you know, 335 million Americans. It's interesting to me how famous he got for working against the proper process with 27 people, is the way I view it. But I believe that 20 of those ended up dying, and only 2 were actually proven to have a terminal disease at the time of their autopsy after. And so what he sold was a bill of goods of, you know, if you're worn out on something, I'm going to help you die because it's merciful. Well, murder is murder, whether it seems merciful or not. You know, I just cannot justify that assisted death process. And of course, there were laws enacted that frankly nobody really follows because nobody's comfortable with, you know, somebody coming in saying, oh, you know, I haven't felt very well. Well, if you thought about dying, we could help you. You know, that just is, that's bad form. That doesn't help you build a practice. Yes.
This is really, I didn't know that topic was going to come up. So it's pretty personal. In 2001, we had our youngest son, Nolan. And we had an emergency C-section, and Nolan had, it was, infection had just ravaged his body.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's an emergency C-section. My wife was still recovering, and the doctor came in and said, we need a decision. We can keep him alive, but the infection had just ravaged
everything.
Everything. And the informed consent, I got full disclosure.
And which is difficult, by the way, too.
Yes.
Absolutely. It's painful.
Of course, no one was there. I mean,
yeah.
Family, because this was an emergency situation. It wasn't me and Jamie researching. I had to make that decision. There was a peace beyond understanding of clarity, I guess, that came in that I didn't feel alone.
Wonderful.
Even after the doctor said, look, we can, after we need a decision soon, but whatever you decide, we need to act soon. The decision was let him go to Jesus.
Yeah. And
that decision at the time, there was a clarity of the right choice. But after they removed all the equipment, I was able to hold him for 45 minutes. And watching him struggle, it made me doubt, did I make the right decision?
Wow.
And then part 2 was then going to telling Jamie.
Yeah.
I'm going to tell my wife. That was almost harder.
Oh, yeah. I can't imagine having to go through that.
Just what you said earlier, that your definition of the brain, and that the body sometimes outlives the brain, and sometimes vice versa. There are times that even though I felt it was there and that God was there with me, I still, even as of today, since 2001, that I can talk myself out of, was that the right
Wow.
decision? Even though at the time I felt
Yeah.
that there was because I knew prayers were lifted up for,
Yeah.
as they always
Yeah.
are for me and my wife, our family growing
Right.
up.
That's an unusually horrific situation to have to go through.
But I keep,
Yeah.
but it's revisiting decisions
Yeah.
that I think part of the Christian ethics is that it's not so cut and dry that you make that choice, whether for yourself or
Mhm.
a loved one, of letting the world, I guess, try to talk you out of that you
Yeah.
make the right decision. If that somewhat makes
I want to address that. I appreciate your testimony on that. And just to summarize for the tape, he's talking about in 2001, he had a child born emergently with horrific infection, and there was not, I believe, not any way for him to survive. And he died in his arms after 45 minutes or so struggling. And that he had a peace that passes understanding at the time, but yet still has some degree of rethinking that. Is that a fair summary?
yes,
And, I think that is, to me, and I want to make sure I put this in the right perspective, because I believe from what you've told me, you did absolutely the right thing. I don't think he would have recovered. I don't think there's a chance, frankly. I think that was an inevitable last hour of life. And I think that is horribly difficult. If you are, let's say you take your mom to lunch for Mother's Day, and of all the horrible things, she collapses there in the restaurant, and you try CPR and you think, oh man, I'm not so good at this. I never did the class and I don't know what to do. And then will they never get here with the emergency staff and whatever, the EMT crew? And if she passed away in that circumstance, I can tell you everybody I know who's ever been in anything horrific like that thinks to themselves what could have been. What I believe we need to realize is what is. And I think that in that circumstance, he had no chance of survival. The reason I believe that comes up for you at times is simply that you love that baby. And I think it's natural to have the thought of, well, what could have been, what maybe would have been different, could we have seen signs earlier, whatever. None of that can change. And I feel like it's almost like somebody living in sin, and that's where I want to carefully make clear, I don't think there was sin involved in that. But if somebody is living in sin that has some difficult circumstance, let's say in the worst case scenario, they drive drunk and they kill somebody. I think there are a million ways you can rethink that. And if you become a Christian and are forgiven by the blood of Christ, I think you are forgiven. But I think it's supernatural, naturally occurs to continually think, boy, what could have been? What could I have done? Who could I have called? Why did I have that last drink? Why did I drive? Why did I ever get a driver's license? All these things. And at some point, that almost even becomes, why was that poor guy right there then? And you'll never know the answer to that. And I think if you are then a forgiven child of God, that is part of the fabric of who you are to minister to other people. And I think it's terrible to have to go through something like that. I think it's it is always going to be part of the fabric of who you are, but it is always able to be forgiven through the blood of Christ. And I think that Satan works out a way for us to live in regret. And I think that sometimes that regret's an obvious reason for it. Sometimes it's a flash thought like, oh man, I could have, told somebody I was a Christian. I sort of implied I wasn't in this circumstance, and we went on. I don't know whatever happened to them. There are all kinds of ways to live in regret, but what God tells us is our past is forgiven and we move forward. And I think you will never go through a moment or an extended period of time rather in life where you don't think about that. But I think that the peace that passes understanding is what should still be what you ask God for. And we should ask God for you for that, because nobody should have to go through that. But you did, and you minister to people because of that. And I think that's the way that God has designed our lives to be able to move forward, and to be able to be servants of his despite that. If we had nobody who had been through a family death, and we had a family death in our church family, we wouldn't know what to do. As it is, we have some experience we can call on. Do I see a hand again? Yes.
I was just gonna say, in his case, Satan keeps revisiting him.
Oh, yeah.
So in your case, you have to cut out that stronghold of the devil. You have to watch, say, okay, I've made this choice. Then Satan will come in.
Get summoned.
Again, and steal your joy. So it's totally up to you to put that, just overcome it. Shut that thought out and get it on. That's the way I.
Yeah, I'll also say, because I think that's true. But remember the name the devil means the accuser. And I think it's always important to realize that we always have accusers. You could try to live the best way you possibly can, and two things will be true. One is you're still going to die someday. And just being honest about it. And the other is Satan will try to accuse you of something. And it's, and just a second, give you a chance to talk. But I think it is just part of that fabric. And I appreciate you sharing that with us, because I think that is an all too real example of what is a horrible situation for a young guy to have to deal with on a moment's notice. And I think that, I'm thankful I've not had anything quite like that. The odd thing is I'm in the spot to advise people on things like that. And it's very easy to pick what somebody else should do. And we all have to keep track of that. The one example I always remind myself of is trying to eat at a table in a restaurant with my kids when they were young. And, it's so easy to look across the restaurant and say, man, that guy needs to tell his child not to yell. And this lady needs to tell her child not to throw his food at his sister. And you can fix everybody else, and there may be chaos at your own table. And it's just that that's what you've been given to grow in. Go ahead.
The scenario that you just mentioned is when the criticism is hard enough when it's internal, and I had to realize where that message is coming from. But when the message is also coming from extended family,
Yeah.
And from even those who are Christian, are saying, "Hey, life is life. It's life. It's life." Whether or not there's brain activity, but why did you tell them to remove the cords if they say that they can keep him alive? I mean, it's been.
Yeah, and I'm sorry that happens too.
Story at one end, but even so, it made me realize that the devil's not just the message that he's sending to the eternal.
You're right.
He's also acting through others.
Oh, absolutely. That accusation.
This way,
yeah.
I'll get you through your fill in the blank.
That can come so many ways. Yeah, absolutely. And so I do think, and I really appreciate you sharing that too, because I think it's really hard to deal with other people who are certain that they know what should happen. And I can tell you, I'll tell you one of the most challenging, and I want to make sure we wrap up on time, because the year's almost over. I got to do that once this year. But I often think about, just from my own viewpoint of prayer, faith, and a response to what people want in terms of a medical solution. It's great wishful thinking to think that there was one little thing you could do and switch it and make everything fine there. That is not reality. It just isn't. That's just the nature of the frailty of life. And it always makes me think, way back years ago, I was seeing a patient in the hospital who happened to also be a member here. And he was extremely ill. And I was seeing him twice a day at that time. And so I stopped by to see him at the hospital on my way to Wednesday night services. And so I went in the room. He had agonal breathing. Near the end, his heart rate had slowed to like 40. He had no response to anybody. He was, for all intents and purposes, essentially dead. And so, and indeed he died that night. But, it's about 4 hours later. But I knew that there was no chance that he was going to live. And so I walk in the door and somebody says, "Oh, would you lead our prayer? We're going to pray for healing for this individual." And I'm thinking, well, that's hard to pray for healing on somebody that I know is going to be dead within hours. And, and I don't want to limit that faith response and say, oh, there's really no way. But I also know a couple days before I talked to him and he was ready to go, as many people are in that spot. He knew the end was there. And, I think that's very difficult for us to decide, well, we got to get this health back. We got to get him to where he'll struggle through another stay in rehab and try to recover from, a GI bleed or a heart failure or whatever the case is, when his body was so worn out he couldn't. And I don't think that's a lack of faith. I think it's a fair response for us to want there to be healing. But I think the reality is that healing is probably that he will spiritually get to enjoy the rest of eternity with God. And I think that's one of those very difficult deals too. It's easy to swoop in and say, oh, this, you got to extend this life for another 2 weeks, see if some new miraculous cure comes up. And it happens to be available right here in this NICU. And that's probably not going to happen. And I hate to, that's not, I don't think, a lack of faith. I think that's just a reality. And the reality is, for instance, if you're in a head-on collision at 70 miles per hour, you're probably dead, and that's where that correlation comes with the car wreck issue. And I've seen, people who've been shot and they died 2 weeks later because their injuries were unrecoverable. And no amount of the relative coming in from out of town saying, aren't you going to do something, makes that different, Did you have your hand up that time? Yes. Okay. Okay. And that's the reason we're running late. I'm just going to go ahead though. Don't feel guilty.
Exactly what you said, that we pray for people that we know it would be better for them to go on.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And I guess we want to keep people here on earth so badly, so
Yeah.
we miss them. But I told my kids, I said, you guys are good. I feel good about you. I said, if my time comes, let me go.
Well, and I think you need to have that conversation because I think it could happen, and we don't want to think about that. The classic saying, everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die, is in play. It is a challenge. And I'll just close out this discussion, and next week we'll talk about other ethical issues. But I just want to close out with years ago, we had a pastoral care minister, Owen Carney. I don't think he'd mind me mentioning his name even on tape, but maybe we can blur that out. But but he would talk about, people who've been in the hospital and whatever. And one night we were just kind of going through routine, so-and-so, their gallbladder out, they doing okay? Yeah, they're doing fine. They went, they're back out, they made it fine. And we got to somebody who had like a knee replacement, and Owen said, oh yeah, I'm trying to think what. Oh yeah, I remember he went home. And we thought, he's dead. He said, oh no, I mean, he went home, he's fine. It's interesting how our terminology is sometimes with maybe a little misunderstanding too. Thank you for all the comments. It's always a blessing to me.